Welcome to today's event in honor of the International Day of Women and Girls in Science. I'm Dr. Allison Sekuler, President and Chief Scientist of the Baycrest Academy for Research and Education at the Baycrest Center for Geriatric Care, and Sandra Rotman Chair in Cognitive Neuroscience at the Rotman Research Institute, and Professor at the University of Toronto and McMaster. And it's a real pleasure to see so many folks here today. Now, although we're meeting virtually today, we acknowledge that the host institutions, Women's College Hospital and Baycrest, operate on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations who have cared for the land for thousands of years, and those include the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. And we also recognize that the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This land remains home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, which is an agreement to share peaceably and care for the Great Lakes region. And we're really grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land today. Now, you may be taking part in today's meeting or living and working in different territories, so we really encourage you to reflect on the land on which you are located and to consider your relationship both to the land and to the people who are the traditional keepers of the land. Now, wherever you are, we welcome you to today's event. I want to give a special welcome to Women's College Hospital President and CEO, Heather McPherson. We really appreciate you taking the time from your busy schedule to attend the event. It speaks volumes, I think, to the great importance that you place on research and on the advancement of women. And I want to also welcome my incredible and inspiring co-host, Dr. Rulan Parekh, who is the Vice President of Academics at Women's College Hospital. And in addition to her executive position, she also holds appointments as a faculty member in Women's Department of Medicine at the University of Toronto and at the Hospital for Sick Children. Dr. Parekh is an internationally renowned and experienced clinician scientist in kidney disease, and her research program focuses on the clinical utility of biomarkers, including genetics, associated with kidney disease in children and adults. And as the only woman of color leading research at one of Canada's top research hospitals, and the first woman of color to lead research, education, and innovation at Women's College, Dr. Parekh plays a pivotal role in helping to shape and inform hospital strategies to advance health equity and to promote diversity in science, innovation, and education. And she also leads the Emily Stowe Scholars Program to support training in science from high school all the way to faculty for diverse persons. So she really covers a wide range. So welcome, Parekh, and thank you for your leadership in organizing this. I also want to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Cara Tannenbaum, and all of our discussion and panel members, Dr. Nicole Kaniki, Dr. Indra Narang, Dr. Sarah Overington, Dr. Lisa Robinson, and Dr. Brad Waters. And to start, we really just wanted to provide a little bit of background about why we're here and what we hope to achieve in this afternoon session. So, as you know, women and girls represent about half of the world's population, but they are severely underrepresented when it comes to success in science. For example, since the inception of Nobel Prizes in physics, chemistry, and physiology or medicine, fewer than 5% of all of the winners have been women. And that's true not just for this global top prize, but even with less lofty awards and positions in Canadian universities. As we move from undergraduate students through faculty to faculty with top Canadian chair awards, we see fewer and fewer women. And there had been some slight gains since these data were published in 2012. But as many people have been discussing recently, COVID has actually presented a lot of challenges to all of these kinds of gains. Now here in Toronto and Ontario, we see much the same as we do across the country. There are relatively few women who are leading hospital-based research institutes or who serve as division heads or department chiefs. And we can count the numbers of women leading Toronto's academic hospitals on one hand. I think that we're really fortunate, Rulan and I, in that both Women's College Hospital and Baycrest have strong records of women in executive leadership roles, but women are not equally placed amongst all of the roles within Ontario. So Rulan and I are fortunate to be among the few women leading the research portfolios within Ontario hospitals. Now, why does that matter? Although some recent op-eds that you might have read that we're not going to really spend too much time talking about today, those op-eds may have made impassioned pleas to halt the progress toward more diverse representation among researchers and leaders. We are women of science. And science shows that diversity enhances creativity and productivity. Science shows that diversity broadens the nature of questions that we ask to address the needs of women in diverse groups. And science shows that diversity enhances science. And Rulan and I are acutely aware of our positions of privilege as executive leaders in hospital-based research. And we know that although The responsibility to advance women and members from other underrepresented groups falls with everyone. Hospital leaders in particular have a responsibility for that. We're really compelled to work for change and to lead by example. So to know if you're moving in the right direction, you first have to know where you are. And so today, what we're going to be focusing on are equitable metrics. We want to know what to measure and how. And it's been a privilege for me over the last couple of years to be co-championing the Ontario Hospital Association's Research and Innovation Committee's Anti-Racism Task Force with Dr. Jason Berman. And one of our rapid action working groups, chaired by Holland Bloorview's Dr. Azadeh Kushki, has done some terrific work highlighting some of the key issues. And what they've pointed out is that, as the Declaration of Research Assessment, or DORA, highlights, not all metrics are created equal. Traditional metrics like journal impact factors and age indices are viewed as objective, but there are systemic barriers for women in science, for Black, Indigenous, and people of color of science, for LGBTQ2+ in science, and for scientists living with disabilities. All of those groups face barriers that reduce the objective nature of these metrics. And whereas traditionally subjective metrics, assessing factors like scientific independence or leadership of large collaborative research programs, face similar systemic barriers for these groups. And on the other hand, the areas where women and other underrepresented scientists tend to be pulled into more service and mentorship and so on, those areas are not valued to the same extent as traditional metrics. So simply put, there's women's work at home and there's women's work at work, and neither is valued as much as it should be. And the traditional metrics that we've used to assess quality in research were really designed by the people in power for the people in power. And even if the original intent was not to keep others from entering the system and moving ahead, that is in fact the net result. But today we don't want to focus just on what the barriers are and inequities are. We also want to focus on what we can do to affect real change, to enhance health science here in Toronto, throughout Ontario, and across Canada. What should we measure and how can we really make a difference? And we're so fortunate today to have us kick off with our keynote address, one of Canada's true leaders in this area, Dr. Cara Tannenbaum. Dr. Tannenbaum was appointed the Scientific Director of the Institute of Gender and Health in the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, or CIHR, in 2015, and she currently serves as the Department Science Advisor for Health Canada. She's a professor in the faculties of medicine and pharmacy at the University of Montreal, and she is the recipient of several prestigious awards, including the May Cohen Gender Equity Award from the Association of Faculties for Medicine Canada. Dr. Tannenbaum leverages her scientific expertise and experience to provide internationally recognized leadership on the integration of sex and gender-based analysis, or SGBA, into research, practice, and policy. And she's taken aim at the structures that support funding, conduct, and use of research in order to make science more equitable and, by extension, strengthen the quality, relevance, and impact of research. And in her presentation today, Dr. Tannenbaum will outline a vision for the future of how we measure success in research. And she'll build on examples from her work in sex and gender-based analysis policy at CIHR. And she'll also share an approach for identifying and mitigating systemic barriers in academic processes and policies. And by the time she's done, I can guarantee you we will all be armed with the tools that we need to question and challenge systems at play within our own institution. So thank you very much, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Cara Tannenbaum.
Thank you, Allison. I am so excited to be here to celebrate everyone here. I mean, we're celebrating the International Day of Women in Science, but I think we should celebrate you. If you are a woman who does science, if you are a woman who supports science, if you are a man, if you are anybody who supports women in science, then you deserve to be applauded today. And before I start, I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you with gratitude from the traditional land and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe, a little bit north of Montreal here. I use the pronoun she, her. And by virtue of the nature of this talk, I do want to acknowledge and recognize my white, cisgendered, privileged upbringing. I offer humility and an openness to learn from this talk because I'm going to be trying to make it interactive with you, having not had lived experience of some of the intersectional forms of marginalization that we will be discussing today. So how does a keynote speaker make a talk interactive with a couple of hundred participants? That's going to depend on you. But since we want to be the future that we want to see, I think that collective leadership is something that we value. And so what I want to do in the next 20 minutes or so is invite you to reflect with me on, one, why we even use metrics in academic medicine, two, what our current metrics tell us about where we want to be, and three, how you can contribute to making metrics more equitable. So open your chat and tell me why you use metrics. Metrics here are referred to things that we measure. I'm just going to say things that we measure as criteria or maybe to get things. Now, I'm not sure who's in the audience. I'd actually absolutely love if you all wrote in the chat who you are. Are you a resident, fellow, or postdoc? Are you a faculty, healthcare worker, or principal investigator? Are you a funder? Are you a journal editor? Are you a university or academic hospital administrator? Thank you for saying, Anna Canalita, that you're a PhD student. So why do you use metrics? What do metrics mean to you? Who are the metrics in your life? I see that we have a fabulous group of people. Oh, I recognize a lot of names. There's some people that I don't recognize, but I'd love to meet you. Looks like we have a lot of PhD students and postdocs. Some PIs, we have some funders in the audience, journalist and filmmaker, fabulous, senior scientists, nurses. Oh, don't you wish we were in person? How much more fun would it be if we were in person discussing this? Fabulous. So we see who's here. Now I want you to write why you use metrics in your life. Why are metrics important to you? What is being measured in your work around equity, around science? So thank you. I see that Azara says metrics are being used for academic promotion. Oops, it's moving too quickly. Maybe that was somebody else. Azara said that. Cara said to provide evidence to make decisions, to understand gaps in care, as a growth indicator for change, to satisfy administrators and deans, to make sure our network is representative of the world around us. So I see there's a lot of people, depending on who you are, using metrics for different reasons. I see hiring decisions, monitoring and evaluate to find patterns. As an editor for promoting the journal, interesting. Improving patient experience, good. Okay, keep on putting it in. I think I'm starting to see some themes. So I didn't know exactly what you were going to write. I thought that maybe we would say that if you were a resident, fellow, or postdoc, maybe you were using metrics to get hired or to get funded. If you were a faculty healthcare worker, principal investigator, maybe it was to get promoted. I saw something about that. Maybe it's to get funded. Maybe it's to receive metrics. I didn't put down to help patients and improve patient care, but I think that that's a good one there too. Now, if you're a funder or journal editor, some of you wrote to decide who to award grants to or which articles to publish. And if you're a university and academic or hospital administrator, then I saw somebody wrote reputation to establish the ranking, maybe to attract more students and high profile faculty. And then I wrote ensure diversity with a question mark because I didn't see a lot of people write that as one of the reasons why we look at measures. So with everything that you wrote, where are my qualitative researchers in the audience? Was there any common theme that came up? Was there any common motivation for why we measure metrics? And I'll let you think about that. Let's see, I have to go back and see who said they were a researcher and a qualitative researcher here. But what's the common motivation behind all the reasons why we measure metrics? Does anyone want to put something out there? Okay, so monitoring, that's a good one. Measuring productivity, external assessment, progress or moving forward your aims, Someone expects us to prove worth. Do you guys ever feel like all you do is try to justify the reason for why you're doing what you're doing with all your performance reviews and everything? Only things that are measured gets action. That's interesting. Drive change. Someone's being funny. Hi, Brian. Avoid being fired. Of course you're gonna put the humor in there. All the time you feel like you're justifying yourself. To try to assess excellence. Imogen, I see that you wrote that. Assess quality of care. So now we're getting to what are we measuring? And I know I'm taking a bit of time to discuss this with you, but I think it is critical for thinking about where we want to go and what we want to do. Always take a step back and say, what are we trying to achieve, instead of just running on the treadmill and doing what's always there, right? So you put much better answers than I did. I tried to predict what people might say. No one put money. I was just going to call it, at some point. Some people say metrics are about how much you earn. You want to earn more, you want to make more. But what a lot of you said was, what about the recognition, the getting awards, the getting the funded? Now, track. A lot of people said monitor and track. I thought that was good. Equity, or a reputation for scientific excellence or quality. A lot of you, the theme of quality really came out. So let's go forward and let's think about this. Now, if you're talking about the quality of scientific excellence, I have to say, if someone I think wrote this in the chat, we measure what we treasure. So if you look at the B inclusive view of, it happened to be a screenshot on scientific impact, but it could be excellence or quality, then an inclusive lens would mean that we were measuring, community engagement, how well our scientific communication was. Boy, did we see that during COVID, didn't we? How well we mentor, how well we sponsor, how well the training is, how well we promote inclusion and diversity. But is that what we're currently measuring? You can write yes or no in the chat if you want. I will tell you that the answer is no. What we are treasuring are the narrow view on the, let's say this is the left side of my screen. I don't know what side of the screen it is for you, but we measure citations, we measure money. So how do we move the needle to show and measure what we're treasuring? So what does science treasure? Again, the 20th century, and here I put Western science to recognize that there are other ways of knowing, but in the 20th century scientific perspective, who, how, and what did we treasure? Well, we kind of treasured a reductionist paradigm in science, right? Get rid of all the confounders, keep it simple, one variable only. These were predominantly male sex studies aimed at avoiding variability and confounding. Women were considered as small men. But is that what we still want to be measuring as we go into 21st century science? And can we imagine a paradigm shift where it's time we said, the world is complex, humans are complex, we need to embrace a complexity paradigm in science where, yes, there's going to be sex, gender, and other intersecting factors that's going to make it more complicated, but that hopefully will yield benefits for everyone. We need to engage with different groups. We need to develop more complex, multifaceted methods. So that was like what we treasured in what we were doing science on. Now, what did we treasure about how we did science? Well, if you look back at the Western science, 20th century view of things, how we did science was give it to an academic with a strong track record of previous funding and publications. That was the criteria for the best way to do science. Where do we want to move to? I think we want to move to somewhere where value is attributed to collaborative, team-based science. Look, we're doing a collaborative keynote here. I think it's great, right? We want to reward process and impact in addition to inputs and outputs. And then finally, from a Western 20th century science perspective, who did we think was excellent? Well, disproportionately male white settlers with recognized privilege. And I think now we're ready to recognize researchers from all backgrounds, including women, Black, Indigenous, racially diverse leaders, but also teams. So what does the future of measuring success in research look like for you? if you were in charge and you could wave your magic wand and say, this is the new metric that I am going to put in place everywhere to measure excellence, what would it be? It could be about the what, it could be about the how, it could be about the who. What would be, if you don't like the way it is right now, then what would be the metric that you would put in place? Collaboration. So how would you measure collaboration? Mentorship. Good. I like that, Andrea. Thank you. Let's see what other people say. And I'm going to go on. So here's my thinking. And I actually think you guys are, look at this. I mean, I think that if we could have prepared this talk together and then put it here, we would have had a much more inclusive and diverse set of ideas. Oh, good. I'm seeing happiness of the research team. If people are happy, then others are happy. Engaging people with lived experience, influencing thought, equity, impact on the communities, translation of knowledge to practice, teamwork, innovation, sex and gender would be considered beyond the binary. Thank you, Jack. Qualitative description of how research benefits society, fulfillment of personal goals for one's own work. Really interesting there. Thank you, Nisha. All right, well, you could see on the slide, you know, I'm kind of looking at the chat and looking at the slide and also trying to sound coherent during all this. Boy, did COVID teach us, as if we didn't know how to multitask before, but how to multitask, right? So what we were measuring, you know, current criteria for research excellence was we wanted high quality research, but really we were only looking at the internal validity of the research, right? So we were using single sex studies, we used aggregate analyses. The dominant group was always the white male to whom some subgroups are compared. Are there any statisticians or epidemiologists in the audience? What's always our default dominant comparison, right? Tayet, oh good, you have a magic wand too. That's great. Yes, I'd like you to wave your magic wand too. So where do we want to go though? I think that, you know, with the what at least, quality needs to be defined by both the internal validity of the research and the science, but also the external validity so that it benefits everyone. That means including sex, gender, and other identity factors. Some people said that. It means disaggregating analyses and using intra-categorical comparisons rather than inter-categorical comparisons. Now, I'm going to take my hat off for a moment to acknowledge an Indigenous scholar who I have a lot of respect for, Harlan Pruitt, who's a Two-Spirit First Nations Cree. And he's the one who really opened my eyes to the racism that's embedded in the way we do science. And so he said to me, you know, Cara, like, what's the deal? You get your data set, everyone wants numbers, everyone wants to measure and compare. And then what you do is you take us Indigenous people and you compare our responses to the rest of you. And he says, and what's the point of that? Is it because you think that you can make Indigenous people like white people? I am never going to be a white male. Why are you comparing me to them? Not only are you comparing me to them, but it's always the same thing. We have more diabetes. We have more obesity. Our rates of opioid use are higher. Well, how do you think that makes me feel? It makes us feel like, oh boy, we're bad. And then if you're the people listening, you go, oh good, we're better. He said, this perpetuates racism. Can't we move to equity science? He said to me, equity science is if you look within groups, within intersecting groups, and you say, okay, so how come within this group of people with similar characteristics, perhaps some are doing a little bit better than others, and what could we learn from them in a context that really applies? And so I'm throwing out the word equity science at you to really make you reflect on some of the lack of diversity and possibly racist methods that we're using without even realizing it. So here's another question for you. True or false? Once research culture is established, it is impossible to change it. I mean, we've been living in the same research culture for a long time. So I see that we have a lot of optimistic people here. A few realists, false, but it's difficult. I think that that's probably true. Hard, but not impossible. The most effective form of change is generational change. Yes, but that takes time and some of us are impatient. And then, hi, Sophia. Sophia says, we will try. That's great attitude. So the good news is that the answer is false. We did move the needle at CIHR for sex and gender integration. I'm going to quickly tell you how. So first of all, you need to measure what you treasure. Back in 2011, we introduced the sex and gender box that many of you are familiar with, telling people, hey, this is even on our radar. Because if you're not measuring it, then you give the impression that it's not important. As soon as we increased the box, and we told people that they had to justify their answer, that was kind of interesting. It's not just yes and no. They had to justify their answer. We got a 50% increase in the proportion of researchers who said that they would account for sex and gender in their research. Was that enough? No, because here's a good take home. If you introduce a new metric, you need education and coaching to tell people what you expect. And within a metric, what would be a good answer or a good score and what would be a bad score. So here we had education and coaching. We made some training modules, which are being updated, by the way, so keep your eyes peeled for that. We had sex and gender champions integrated into the team, and we got another 30% increase towards, and somebody said track and measure. So here we're tracking and measuring if we're getting closer to where we want to be. And the goal was to fundamentally change culture, which I'm pleased to say that we did. How did we do it? We gave the evaluators criteria for scoring what the applicant said. So they had to rate it as a strength or a weakness. And we told them, you know, if the applicant wrote this, it's a strength. If the applicant wrote this, it's a weakness. And here, for those of you who like data, the odds of successful funding if 2 or more reviewers scored, for instance, sex is a strength, and the funding cycles, I didn't look at COVID yet, became significant. So you are more likely to get funded now if you are appropriately integrating sex and gender. So that is fundamentally changing culture. And those 10 years felt super, super, super long. But in the grand scheme of things, that's probably pretty quick. So what can you do? Well, are you involved in scoring anything? I saw there were some PhD students, some postdocs, you probably do student poster competitions. There's probably research days. In the scoring criteria for your poster, or even when you submit your abstract, is there a box that says, are you practicing equity science? Do you have both sexes of cells? And did you disaggregate that when you looked at your basic science research? Even during a thesis defense, does anyone ever ask questions about, the quality of the research, and is it really benefiting everybody? That's easy. What about a grand rounds checklist? Do we ever give feedback on the inclusiveness of the content? Did they consider trans folk in what they're presenting? Somebody said that they were a charitable funder. I think I saw somebody said that they were from a foundation here. Well, you give out funding. Are you making sure that what's being studied is truly in line with benefiting everybody from a diversity, inclusion, and equitable perspective? And then the same thing with rankings. Are you still going to look at what the citation metrics are? Or are you going to be one of those people who goes and speaks to the people who do the university ranking list and say, hey, I think it's time that we changed our criteria here. So culture starts shifting when we change the norm and we start asking questions. Let's do the second one. We talked about the what is treasured in research. Now let's talk about how the conduct of research needs to go. So when you're really looking at track records of previous funding and publications, it's about the numbers. Somebody wrote productivity, right? It's about the productivity metrics. What is produced matters, the quantity of citations, the impact factor of the journal, the number of papers as first and last author, the number of patents in your name, the number of research dollars you get as principal investigator, the number of students supervised. So is more always really better? I think where we want to go is to put a focus possibly on more qualitative metrics. These should be process and impact metrics, where the how is as important as what you produce, how you produce it. Is there adherence to open science principles in the spirit of collaboration? Is the lab culture as important as the lab outputs? I saw someone wrote happiness. Is team science valued? Does everyone state their role on the team? Is there a diversity of students supervised and not just number of students supervised? And instead of just citations, are we actually explaining how societal impact is achieved, either because you took the time to give policy advice, because what you did changed practice, because of your engagement with community, it led to uptake of more educational tools that changed practice. So, and thinking, so, if that's what we want to measure, then that's what, we need to change. Now, Allison, you mentioned DORA. That's the Declaration on Research Assessment. And the good news is that worldwide, I think we are trending in the right direction. At one point, that was what the teacher said about my son in school. I thought it was funny. He's trending in the right direction. So we are trending in the right direction. See, there you go. Identity. I'm a mom. I'm not just a speaker here. Hopefully, we're talking about our ideas, but it needs to be in the context of happiness and family and not just, that treadmill. So obviously Dora's saying don't use journal-based metrics. And I put up a fun fact here. How many of you knew that the journal impact factor was originally created to help librarians identify journals to purchase, not to measure the scientific quality of the research in an article? Just goes to show that where's my anthropologists and historians, and why my Indigenous and racialized colleagues always tell me it's important to look at things from a historical perspective. But we're moving. So it's not just about the productivity, I think. It's about the quality of what we're doing and how we are doing it. I hope you could see this slide. It's a slide from the Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And what I want to point you to, just over here, they said the past is about measuring output, the quantity of what you did, that it was closed and you had a patent and it was private, your H-index and impact factors, the amount of funding received. And they're moving to outcome, from output to outcome-oriented metrics, where the quality of what you do, whether you're making it open, how about those narratives and meaningful metrics and societal relevance should be measured. And there's some pilot projects going on right now to see how that plays out. Maybe your institution should be one that does this for Canada. And who's going to make that happen? No one else but you. So you can shift value to open collaborative science by questioning the status quo. Did you know now on Google Scholar that they say how many of your articles are open access? Well, shouldn't that be in your performance review? As a researcher, department chair, institution leader, do a self-assessment. Are your articles open access? Is your department's articles open access? Is your institution's articles open access? Are you sharing? Are you being collaborative? Do you have an open portal? And if you're somebody like a journal editor or funder, are you making it easy and affordable for researchers to make their research open access? I mean, look at this little quote here, horrifying, $11,000 US to publish in Nature Neuroscience. We're going to go talk to those folks. Not exactly very equitable. So what do I think your annual performance review should look like? Maybe for promotion and tenure, let's focus on your EDI mentorship and capacity building. In your team, do you have an onboarding and mentorship structure in place for the team, including EDI training? Does your lab, are people happy? I love that happiness. Fulfilled happiness, that's a whole other talk. Are we searching for happiness, impossible, or fulfillment? Happiness biologically was just supposed to be so that you eat and procreate. That gives you those endorphins. But fulfillment, maybe a fulfilling and safe space for trainees and staff to give constructive feedback to their supervisors. Does your lab clearly outline those trainee and staff rights, as well as a mechanism for seeking support if they feel unsafe? Do you have a mandatory sexual harassment policy reporting and training practice in place in your lab? And for teaching, it shouldn't just be about, the score that you get because you have a great sense of humor or your slides look great. You should be valued on the inclusivity of the course content, maybe the diversity of the guest lecturers that you bring in. for grand rounds or teaching. And in terms of administration and service, is it whether you're sitting on a committee or not, or is it what you contribute while you're on that committee? Your contributions to inclusive departmental policies. What about your knowledge mobilization activities, engagement with underrepresented communities? So a lot of you said that. So, but the checklists aren't enough. You need accountability structures in place to ensure that implementation is effective and meaningful. So the last part of my talk is about how we measure who is scientifically excellent. And here, I think we're looking in terms of the diversity and inclusiveness of our leadership environment so that our faces represent the faces of those that we serve, whether they be our patients, whether they be our students, whether they be the faculty, whether they be the folks for whom we're doing research to improve their lives. Now, here's where I was going to end my talk. And then I took a step back and I said, okay, did I do what you asked me to do? And I said, hey, I actually talked a lot about diversity and inclusion, but have I actually talked about equity? And equity means something than diversity and inclusion. So I've added 4 more slides to the talk, and I hope that's okay. A little bit maybe over time, but let's, can you bear with me? Okay, good. So equity, when you think about it, is about power and privilege. And then I started thinking, so does that mean that equitable metrics should be about measuring the effort needed for marginalized individuals to achieve the same outcomes as more privileged individuals? And is it about leveling the playing field to facilitate that process? And here's the wheel of power and privilege that we've adapted. And depending on where you are in that wheel of power and privilege, you are going to have a much harder time with everything than if you're in the middle, whether you're dominant on all of these characteristics. So, true or false? The Leaky Pipeline model is an accurate description of the challenges women face in science. And you'll see where I'm going with this, but tell me, do you think that's true or that's false? So I have some truths, some falses. I know it's a controversial question. Too simplistic, says Robin. Hi, Robin. Some truth, maybe false, starts earlier. Why am I asking you this question? I'll tell you why I'm asking you this question. Because exactly, it doesn't include the intersectionality of identity, but here's a paper from Nature Geoscience on the right that says it isn't a passive process at all. And the leaky pipeline metaphor, there are many reasons why I don't like the leaky pipeline metaphor for women, just in general, but it's too passive because there are actual roadblocks. I mean, this picture just says 1,000 words, right? Or look at the one on the left, the leadership ladder, or even the ladder for getting hired. It's so much harder for women to maybe reach that first rung if they're also taking care of children, taking care of older parents, being the primary person responsible for housework, the bias, everything else, being put on the EDI committees, asking to do service, the amount of time it takes to build relationships to do science rather than just writing your papers. So if none of these are valued, then we're actively making it difficult for women and marginalized and intersectional women to progress. Now, I don't have to tell you this, but there's inequities across a variety of success metrics used in science. Authorship, you probably know. Teaching, this paper just horrified me. Did you know that they did a study where they asked students for a female professor when she wasn't pregnant and when she was pregnant to evaluate her, and the evaluations, of course, dropped when she was pregnant. I mean, go figure, right? Parenthood, publication, peer review. There's a lot of things that women just, are not, I think, being valued for all the things that we do. I mean, have you ever carried like 9 months a baby and tried to give a talk? Do you know how out of breath I was when I did that? But I still went. And I'm going to tell you guys, this is very shameful or embarrassing. And you know what happened after my talk? a faculty came up laughing. Two faculty were laughing at me and saying, "Oh my gosh, you were so out of breath. That was so funny to watch you try to give that presentation. You could barely breathe." That's what they took out of my presentation, not easy, right? So, and then intersectionality, look at these metrics. So is a metric, meaning we ask you to self-identify, is a metric measuring how many racialized women, Black women, West Asian women. And again, racialized is also a tough term. I mean, there's good evidence that depending from what group you're from, you might have a harder time because, I'm just going to throw this out there. Tiger moms, are there any tiger moms in the audience? In Asian culture, education is super, super valued. But if you're from Black culture that comes with a history of slavery from the South, then maybe the education is only more recently being valued because of what you've gone through historically. So should we be measuring self-identity? Or, and this is my last slide, I think, should we actually, slide doesn't want to advance. Should we actually be measuring, there we go, privilege or lack of privilege? Because you may be Black, you may be Asian, but if you came from a privileged background where there was money in the family and you didn't have to take out loans or have a job during your studies to pay for your education, maybe you didn't, maybe it was easier for you. If you have even one parent or guardian who attended college or university, then education and achievement was valued. But if you weren't given that message early, then how much more did you have to fight to tell people why you wanted to go to university? Some people think it's a waste of time. And you had to fight for that. Are you able to move through the world without fear of sexual assault? Does that influence the conferences you go to, whether you stay out late having drinks, and doing that networking? Does it impact your choice of where you work? Were you ever offered a job because of your association with a friend or family member? That is privilege. That's connections. That makes it easier for somebody to advance. Or have you ever been the only person of your race, gender, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation in a classroom or workplace? A lot of energy goes into feeling different. A lot of energy goes into that responsibility of saying, at least from what I've been told, I'm the only member of the LGBT community here. I'm the only member of the Black community here. And I have a burden on my shoulders to represent everyone, even though we're so different and we have different needs. But that is a lot of stress. That takes a lot of energy. That takes a lot of effort. And are we measuring that? Should we have spots or quotas? Should we be asking this when people apply? Should we be acknowledging effort? Because in a way, that's what equity really represents. Are we doing it? Are we streamlining applications by equity-seeking groups? Well, there are some ways of doing this. For instance, at CIHR, that intra-categorical approach that I told you about. We have a peer review panel just for Indigenous health research. The NIH at one point said we want applications from individuals from diverse backgrounds and tell us how you're diverse. Now, there's a lot of pushback to this. I'm going to be honest with you. People say, are you changing what scientific excellence is about? And I'll tell you what my answer to that is. I say, no, we're not changing it. There's nothing wrong with what we were measuring, but it's time we evolved to include other measurements and appreciate the effort that goes into doing things. But this is going to take quite a bit of effort on our part to make people see the value of it. So how do we get there? Barks are nice, but we need bites. Should there be penalties for failing to integrate metrics of success, equitable metrics? And the levers of influence depend on motivation for all these things. Are you motivated? Are you being transparent? Are we rewarding transparency and accountability? Here's like an open science portal from the Charité institution in Germany, where they're being very forthcoming about what they're doing. And here's another one from Cara, where they're telling narrative stories of innovation and change and success that's not traditional. So I would invite you to be the future that you want to see. This is what I want to see in research. And what can you do now to get us there faster? That's the end of my talk. Now you have the most amazing panelists to give some thoughts about this. So thank you. Thank you very much. And I look forward to you being the future that we get to see.
Thanks so much. Cara, if that deck can get stopped, thank you very much. And I'll put this one back on. Okay. Thank you so much. That was an amazing, amazing talk. And I'm so glad you made it as interactive as you did. I think, you know, we're going to have a great time going through all of the different responses, and obviously we'll make sure that they get shared with you, Cara. But I think, you know, the diversity of responses and the numbers of people who are here was just really phenomenal. But we do want to get right to the next part of the event, which is to bring on our panel. And Dr. Rulan Parekh is going to be moderating this, but I want to quickly introduce the folks who are going to be on the panel for you. So in addition to Cara, you'll also have Dr. Lisa Robinson, who is the Vice Dean Strategy and Operations at the University of Toronto's Temerty Faculty of Medicine, and she's a former Associate Dean for Inclusion and Diversity at SickKids. And in that role, she worked collaboratively to build alliances and develop strategic partnerships and engage international, sorry, one second, I'm not sure why that's doing that. There we go. And to engage international external partners to enhance and promote the diversity of inclusion of faculty, learners, and staff across the Faculty of Medicine at SickKids. Dr. Robinson is also the founder and director of Kids Science, which is a SickKids Research Institute program that provides opportunities for middle and high school students to improve their understanding of science and technology. And in 2014, she launched the Student Advancement Research, or STAR program, which is a SickKids summer research program for high school students from underrepresented communities that's now being migrated into lots of other different organizations as well. So welcome, Lisa, we're really glad to have you here. Next, we've got Dr. Sarah Overington, who is the Director of Science and Engineering Promotion within Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, or NSERC. And in this role, Sarah leads a team that delivers a wide range of programs supporting research training, science promotion, and recognition through prizes. Sarah has worked with a variety of disciplines and programs in her career at NSERC, and she's continued her focus on integrating equity, diversity, and inclusion throughout program design and delivery. And I've worked a lot with Sarah at NSERC in the past, and it's really great to have you here. And for people who are wondering about academic creds, Sarah holds a Bachelor of Science honors and a PhD, both in biology from McGill University. So welcome, Sarah. Next, we've got Dr. Nicole Kaniki, who joined the University of Toronto as its first Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Research and Innovation in 2021, right in the peak of the pandemic. But she has been keeping busy. Despite that, she's finding a lot of ways to examine and advocate for an advanced equity, diversity, and inclusion in all aspects of U of T research, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And that includes serving as an advisor and resource to researchers at all levels, leading workshops. She just led some excellent ones for us at Baycrest, developing training programs, and contributing to U of T's EDI goals more broadly. And the former special advisor of anti-racism to the president of Western was her past role. You know, it's in the EDI lens is vital to all stages of the research process, from coming up with research questions to thinking about who is affected by those questions and who's asking them in the first place. And so we'll probe a little bit more deeply in some of those areas with Nicole, so welcome. Next, we've got Dr. Brad Waters, who is the Executive Vice President of Science and Research at UHN, and he's also a Senior Scientist at Princess Margaret Cancer Center and a Professor at the University of Toronto. His research program examines how the molecular mechanisms underlying hypoxia work and how the tumor microenvironment affects cancer biology and therapeutic outcome. And as EVP of Science and Research, Dr. Waters is focused on creating an environment that incentivizes, facilitates, and rewards excellence in research across all elements of UHN. And one of his signature priorities was sorry, my phone was beeping at me, so I've got to get my train of thought back. One of his signature priorities is to be a leader in embedding principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion in all aspects of the institution's research enterprise. We heard a little bit from about that previously. and we're going to hear more about it coming up. He's integrated that into selecting chairs, engaging youth from underrepresented backgrounds, and providing education and training for leaders in global practices. And I have to also say, just thank you to Brad, because Brad is sort of like our local leader at TASN, and he has really gone above and beyond in terms of certainly supporting folks like Rulan and me, who are the first of our kind in terms of being women or women of color in these roles, and making sure that we have the support that we need to succeed, but also in making sure that he's advancing the way that metrics are working within EHN. He's going to talk a little bit more about that, I think, on the panel as well. And last but certainly not least, we've got Dr. Indra Narang, who is the former director of sleep medicine and a staff respirologist in the Division of Respiratory Medicine, and the associate chair in faculty development, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the Department of Pediatrics at the Hospital for Sick Children. She's a senior scientist, senior associate scientist in translational medicine at the Research Institute, and also an associate professor at the University of Toronto. And she's the pediatric lead and executive member of the Canadian Sleep and Circadian Network, which is a national network of pediatric and adult researchers in Canada funded by CIHR. And in her associate role, Dr. Narang's vision is for an engaged and empowered faculty who have equity of opportunity to achieve their full potential as clinicians, researchers, educators, and leaders. Some of the sorts of things that came out in the chat when Cara was doing her presentation. Dr. Narang has been instrumental in establishing workshops and training to promote equitable, diverse, and inclusive environments. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rulan, who's going to talk a little bit more about what we hope to get out of the panel. And also, I just want to remind people that you can be putting questions into the Q&A throughout the panel, so that we'll be keeping track of those, so that in addition for Rulan asking questions and having discussion amongst the panel, we want to be sure that we really are bringing all of you into the conversation as well. So over to you, Rulan.
Thanks so much. This is very exciting, and we've had lots of comments already, and I think it's great to see. I think a key thing is we want to be the future we want to see. So Cara's charged us with that, and what we want to talk about today are really how do we actually measure these metrics in order for us to be able to move forward. And so I'm going to quickly get into it, because we have about 45, 50 minutes, and I look forward to having people make comments in the chat if they want, but if you want a specific question, please make sure you put in the Q&A. I've got multiple screens open so I can check them at the same time. And I'm going to start first by asking the panelists different questions, and then we'll get back to the Q&A session. So Brad, if we could start off with you, you've been a great ally in terms of equity, but when you're considering issues of developing equity metrics for women and others from underrepresented groups in science, how do you approach this role as an ally?
Well, thanks, Rulan, and thanks to you and Allison for organizing this event, and to Cara for a fantastic talk. I think it starts with listening to experts, and Cara was a great example for all of us again today. We're fortunate to be in a community that is full of strength and expertise in a huge diverse set of areas. For someone like myself and the position I'm in, it's also around a commitment to learning and a commitment to understanding from experts, from those with lived experience and those with academic insight into these areas to understand what needs to be done. So that's part of it. Having an opportunity for open and moderated discussions about equity, an opportunity to hear from those in your community, to understand what it is that we want to achieve as an organization. And I really like this concept that Cara outlined that the University of Utrecht published a while ago around this move from trying to measure output to measuring outcome. And I think our indicators that we use to measure outcome, these are the metrics that we want to establish in our organizations. And in order to define, what those metrics need to be, we first of all need to define what our goals are. What does success look like? What are we trying to achieve as an organization? And that is a collective effort, and defining that is a collective effort too. And as we put together our strategic plans and define, what it is that we're trying to achieve together, ensuring that we have an understanding of what that is will help us define the metrics that we want to use to measure against those. It's important that, and we as an organization at UHN decided that inclusivity and diversity and equity and accessibility is part of what we're trying to achieve. And this has been woven into our strategic plan. It's working its way into being part of everything that we do across the organization. And so part of that means also developing the metrics to measure our success against that. And we've been going through a process over the last year or so on trying to define that. We're a signatory of DORA, and we've got an entire committee together that's working through helping us define what those metrics should be, and looking at those measurements of output and more progressive forms of measuring success against those goals. We've also been working on trying to define metrics that reflect our success not only as individuals, but also as departments and as an organization as a whole, so that the responsibility for that success lives with both individuals as well as teams and leaders and the organization and those that govern us and govern that organization. So this also has a lens at all levels of the organization, including our board, and we feel a responsibility to report and to measure our success against those at all levels of the organization.
Thanks, Brad. I think, important concept of, again, what Cara said, output to outcome. And I think critical that you've got leadership all the way from the board down to the individual, right, to be able to make those changes. Lisa, you've done something similar in thinking about the Faculty of Medicine, and you've been a strong advocate for collecting data to address these inequities, in particular about the lack of women of women in color in leadership. As a woman of color, you've also commented about the minority tax in academia that's not often accounted for. And I was wondering, what are potential remedies to address this issue?
So first of all, thank you so much. Thank you to Rulan, thank you to Allison, thank you, Cara, for a really inspiring talk, and thank you to all of you. It's such a privilege to be on this panel. And thank you for this question, Rulan. I really appreciate it. So if it's all right, I'd like to offer maybe some personal reflections and then some structural considerations for all of our institutions. This question really resonates. I think all of you know it's Black History Month. So let me tell you what that means to some of us who happen to be Black and other women of color in spaces like this. So, in a couple of weeks ago, within about a 10-day period, I received 10 invitations to present, to participate on panels, and to be involved in other activities. And there's really nothing special about me. I think that's the experience that's shared by many, many people like me. I think the fewer the number of people like you there are in academic spaces, the higher the minority tax can be. There are many asks, as I think we all know, to educate others, to sit on committees. And as Cara said earlier, oftentimes to be that one voice charged with representing the voice of your entire community. And just as an example, after the murder of George Floyd, the racial reckoning in the months following that. So I would regularly receive between 200 and 250 emails a day asking me to participate in various things. So the majority of these emails would be asking me to do something. I think I'm quite used to it now. I've been really the only in essentially every space that I've ever been in, educationally and career-wise, as a Black woman, physician, scientist, and one who does basic science. There are very, very few of us. So, when I think about it, the messages that I would like to get across are our institutions need to really try to understand what it is like to be the only, what it's like to try to walk while you're trying to make a path at the same time. I wish that our institutions could try to recognize how challenging it can be for folks to exist in these kinds of spaces that were really never designed for us to be here in the first place. And so, as we're trying to progress, we navigate lots of different things, including micro invalidations that sometimes aren't so micro. Erasure of our experience is sometimes casual and sometimes deliberate. being held to different standards. And as Cara said earlier, that constant need to have to prove that we're worthy of being in these spaces that we move in. And part of the tax, and I use that word, I am actually reluctant to use that word in this context, is the deep responsibility that we feel to mentor those who come behind us, because we know the power in it. I cannot tell you how many times young students have told me that I'm the first Black doctor that they've ever met, and they didn't even know that there was such a thing as any Black women doctors who do science. I had an example, I've had so many examples, but one that really stuck out was a young student, a Black student who worked in my lab, who was the first in her family to pursue post-secondary education, who'd never, met a Black doctor nor a Black scientist. And she told me that because of seeing the power of possibility, she went on and then she pursued graduate studies. And I think we feel this power, deep inside us. I'll just give you one more example. I do lots of outreach events. I'm deeply committed to that type of work and outreach events that touch undergraduate students from underserved communities, among others. So a couple of years ago, I was at one event. I did two in 2 nights. And at the end of the second night, there was a line of students down the hallway who were lined up to speak to me. And again, it's not because there's anything special about me, it's because they had no access to mentors like them. And so I stayed 2 hours past when I actually really needed to leave to talk to those young people. And over those 2 nights, I had 12 students ask me if I could formally mentor them. And I said yes to every single one, because I can never say no. I never want to say no, because I know the power of representation. But when you add that to the dozens and dozens of people who I already mentored, you start to feel it. And when you think about it, our institutions rely on this labor of women of color to help further their equity mandates. And especially now as they're forming new EDI committees and launching new EDI initiatives. So what can our institutions do in return? And when I think about a roadmap that's actionable, I really like a paper that was published last year, actually 6 months ago, in the New England Journal of Medicine. And so that was written by Teresa Williamson, who's a physician at Duke. It's called Minority Tax Reform, Avoiding Overtaxing Minorities When We Need Them Most. And there's a few actionable things that I'll just sort of outline. So the first thing is what we talked about earlier. And so that's what Dr. Williamson terms the tax reduction strategy. And so really thinking about minimizing disproportionate committee service for women of color. And it's a balance as well, because we really do need to ensure that their voices help us to guide policy reform to address structural inequities. The second is a tax deferral strategy, as she terms it. And this is, allowing space for women from underrepresented communities to maybe delay their committee service contributions until their careers are more established, because it's really critical that those women succeed in whatever it is that we hired them to do, because they are the beacons, they're the role models for those who come after. But the reality is that this doesn't really happen, and it's hard to do this because, as I sort of mentioned, the requests for mentoring and for service occur at every stage, very, very early on, even when you're still pursuing your education. And the other reality is that people feel a deep responsibility to give back. The third strategy is what Dr. Williamson terms equitable tax accounting. And that really requires culture change. And we talked about this earlier, and Cara really highlighted this. Institutions really need to appropriately value this type of work. And some examples, we need to be valuing diversity leadership positions, for example, as much as we value other leadership positions. And so, the resources, the recognition that might go along with being, let's say, the vice chair of education or research, we need to ensure that these positions are valued in the same way. And that the opportunity for promotion, for resources, so human resources, financial resources, protected time are all there. We need to also, institutions really need to think about balancing the tax burden through standardized tax. And again, this is Dr. Williamson's concept. And so ensuring that faculty from dominant groups help to share the work and the responsibility of diversity initiatives, including anti-racism work. You don't need to be racialized to do some of the heavy lifting to affect change. We need to ensure that all faculty are fairly considered for top leadership positions, and not just EDI roles. Because, you know, when we only elevate women and women of color to roles where we're comfortable seeing them, like in EDI roles, that's racist in and of itself. So, you know, the next strategy is the tax refund. And so we need to pay a lot of attention. And we talked a little bit earlier about this to recruitment and retention and career development, leadership opportunities for women who do come from historically marginalized communities. But how do we do that? We need to compensate and value the work that they do through in-kind support. So through grant support, through administrative support, maybe funding for research personnel, and importantly, through protected time. And all of that needs to go along with institutional efforts to support and build community and to create networks, including networks of mentorship for people from underserved communities. And I think hopefully many of you will be aware that last week was the BSTEM conference, so the Black Excellence in STEM that was put on by the Canadian Black Scientists Network. I've never attended an event like that in my life. It was wondrous to see so many people working together and the Black excellence and brilliance around this country and the mentorship and the discussions that happened, you know, that helped to show learners, students, postdocs, and other faculty that there are other brilliant minds around who share your experiences and that you're not alone. And our institutions need to actively support these efforts. So, and some of our institutions did. So for example, NSERC, CIHR, various hospitals among us. And as we talked about a lot, we need to recognize that the traditional metrics that we use, bibliometrics, et cetera, don't capture the impact of the work of women from historically underserved communities. We need to be thinking about what is the local impact of what they're doing. And lastly, I'll just say that we need to pay a lot of attention to purposeful mentorship of women from underrepresented communities to prepare them to serve in many different ways. So for all types of leadership roles, because we need to explicitly recognize that representation does matter, and that's at all levels of leadership, including the most senior levels of leadership. And we need to make intentional efforts to enact these values, because that's how the change happens.
Thanks, Lisa. I think you brought up so many incredible points. You cannot be what you cannot see. And I think this tax framework is actually interesting because people will pay attention because it's terminology that's used often. And I think something to think about, maybe a tax checklist similar to the privilege checklist. So what have you done in your committees, and have you thought through that tax checklist to make sure that you aren't putting a burden on only a select few? So great points. I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit. I'm going to bring up something that actually Cara and I are both surprised about, that nobody mentioned salary equity, because that really is something that we bring up all the time. And it's really been brought up a lot in the Globe and Mail and a lot of the New York Times about differences throughout all sorts of different sectors about salary. And so Indra, you know, one of the greatest challenges in equity is really this discussion on recruitment and the salary, the compensation package, the stipends, the leadership roles. There's a lack of transparency in published salaries among physicians in Ontario, but there's also available data in some other sectors. And yet that hasn't necessarily changed people's perceived or real inequities in terms of salaries. So could you give examples of what you've done in the Department of Pediatrics? And can you really describe some of the challenges that you faced?
Yeah. So good afternoon, everyone. And again, I just want to echo what everybody has said. Cara for a fantastic talk, and to the rest of the panel for being here, and also to Lisa for your mentorship of many of us, including myself. And that does actually make you super special. And so I just, in the Department of Pediatrics at Sick Kids, we've undertaken a comprehensive review of salaries, both between faculty, so that was one goal, but all for faculty who are at the same job description, seniority, and so forth, but also to evaluate for gender pay discrepancies. And I think the overarching goal for us was to ensure robust data collection and robust data analyses. And so to ensure transparency, to your point, Rulan, one of the things that we did, we actually worked with a biostatistician who's external to Sick Kids, who had a lot of expertise in looking at gender pay equity. And that was just to ensure that everything we were doing was fair, but certainly transparent. And I can't share the full results because we're just at the final stage and we have yet to disseminate it to our faculty. But I have to tell you that, we discovered many challenges in looking at this data. And actually the data took us over a year before we were really happy with our final data set. And that is because there wasn't, for example, there was a lot of missing data. We don't have race data, so we couldn't evaluate, the intersection of race and gender on pay. Similarly, we didn't have data on who had, or robust data on recruitment packages, retention packages. And I think we already alluded to this. We didn't have data on, for example, startup packages for research and stipends. And doing the retrospective data analysis, as many of you know, isn't the way really to provide robust data around gender pay inequity. So I think they were the major challenges. And of course, not being able to identify all the factors that contribute to gender pay inequity meant that we don't necessarily have the root cause factors to work on when we think about mitigation strategies to address those gender pay inequities. So I think they summarize the challenges in collecting the data and analyzing the data. And I think us and many institutions also have what I would describe as the naysayers who say, really, I looked at this data quickly and there isn't gender pay inequity. It's a global problem. There are, it's just as you said, you can read the newspaper, you can read articles, there are gender pay discrepancies. And so I would encourage anybody that, look at your data, evaluate your data. So I don't know if that answers all of your questions, but I think that going forward, we also have recognized that, a one-off evaluation of gender pay inequities is only the first step, and many things have to be put into place to achieve equity in salaries. And that's not just increasing the pay, as we've highlighted here. There has to be a lot of mentorship, sponsorship, and so forth to ensure equity of opportunity. And it's equity of opportunity that will also lend to gender pay equity downstream.
Thanks so much. I think it goes back to making sure we have the data that we're actually able to collect and be able to use that data. And so I'm going to move now over to Sarah. So in thinking about the data that funders definitely want to have, how can we move researchers out of the jump through the hoop mentality when completing the grant applications to a work for change mentality?
Thanks, Rulan and everybody. And it was really great to start off with someone who's also working with the granting councils, and so that we have that kind of leadership and in really making change within the councils. So I think one of the things that we do as funding agencies is really focus on excellence, and we're that's why we exist, is to kind of look for that potential and excellence. And I think we're looked, others in the research community are looking to us for guidance on what that means. You pointed to, one of the levers that we have is by putting in place different requirements in our grant programs and different guidelines that we share with researchers. But the important part is making sure that those are not superficial, and that it's more than just writing in applications in order to get grants. And I think some of the ways that we can really make sure that there is work for change is ensuring that it is well understood that those aren't superficial requirements. And I think where I see a lot of room for that influence is in the discussions that we see within peer review. So we have hundreds of academics and researchers who are involved in those peer review discussions. And when we have expectations in the grant, it really opens opportunity for discussion about what we expect, what impact is, what other kinds of not just outputs, but outcomes we would expect to see. And some of the places we can, we see that discussion, I think, especially is when we have interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary committees who are forced to ask those questions a little bit more around what kinds of things we would expect to see and what quality and impact looks like. So I think that that's a place where we have a good opportunity, and really ensuring that there is that there are consequences to not having meaningful information in a grant application where, for example, so we have expectations around what a training program should look like and what kinds of measures should be in place. We have to ensure that there is some follow-up on that, and understanding that it's really more than just kind of a plan, putting a plan in place, but really then looking back at what the impact has been. And I think, you know, we see the panelists here who've had huge impact in terms of the mentorship and training that they provided to others in the research community. Those really show up, and I think making sure that we continue to emphasize the importance of those kinds of impacts is key to making sure that it's more than just writing in an application, but real change within the research community.
Sorry, that actually, that's a great comment, and it segues well into a question I have for Nicole. And it's really the, recently, especially at the conference that was just last week about Black scientists, and thinking about these metrics and how we actually assess intersectionality. But one of the areas, if you could talk about it, is really also the CRC chairs, because I think it goes back to Sarah's point about making sure people are actually fulfilling and saying what they're doing, and are we actually accountable? And so what do we need to do to make sure that we're accountable?
That's a great question. Thanks, Roulette, for the question. And again, too, it's such an honor and a privilege to be here on this panel with all of you. So I think too, at the institutional level, this is why roles like mine that I was created at U of T is so important, in that I'm actually able to be there on the ground and do the work and actually implement. I must say as well, I'm in the, I've been working in research development for about over 6 years, almost 7 years. And it wasn't really until the, NSERC and CIHR and the tri-councils actually brought forward this imperative need for us to think about EDI that I actually had power to be able to start to affect change in the role that I played as administrative support at the institution for research and research programs and so forth, and to be able to have the space and the space created at institutions to start to have these discussions that we're having today, and actually make those changes that we then report on in the grants that come by. And so I think as well, this is where it's been important too, that we have the structural sort of the structural supports in place for research to be able to do this. EDI is new to a lot of researchers, and thinking about it, we've never had to think about it. And so I think providing them with the tools, providing them with the resources to actually be able to do it, to have people there standing by them and providing that accountability at the institutional level is so important. And I think though, too, just keeping in mind exactly something that going back to something Dr. Robinson said was that these roles have to be empowered. So it shouldn't just be one person or, sort of under-resourced themselves expected to change an entire institution's work. I think it's the responsibility of leaders within departments, within faculties and so forth, to also provide opportunities for individuals within those spaces and within the structures to be educated, to be highly skilled too. Even when you're hiring research administrators to support your researchers, do they have EDI skills? And again, too, to so many points to Dr. Robinson's discussion here as well, is that, individuals who do EDI, we're not only EDI people. My background is in sports medicine. I did my master's in kinesiology. I have a PhD in health and rehabilitation sciences. I'm a STEM scientist, but I'm working in EDI spaces now because I've sort of added to my skill set, through a master's in women's studies and feminist research, this understanding that EDI is throughout every aspect of research, whether you are in humanities, social sciences, or in the STEM fields. And so understanding as well that we come with varying degrees of expertise to the science itself, as well as understanding how EDI is embedded within the science of things. And so I think too, it's important for institutions to start thinking about that, because that's when the implementation of EDI strategies becomes more meaningful and impactful and real as well. I think, this work, I sit with a lot of EDI practitioners as well. And a lot of us too in academic settings right now are thinking, okay, where is this going to go? So George Floyd, 2 years ago, unmasked graves, like all of that really was able to sort of give us this momentum. Where are we going from here on out? We don't want to continue with the check boxes and the checklists anymore. We actually want to see research programs diversify through the strategies that we're implementing. We want to see, the diversity of students and trainees increase within these spaces. But I think, we really, it's work not only done by us, but it needs to be part of the leadership, and we need to have buy-in from leadership. We need to have support from the structures and those within these structures to help us do the work to implement, to have the willingness as well to implement, because EDI is not easy. Like I said, it's something that, it doesn't come natural. If it came natural, we wouldn't be here today in 2022, still trying to figure out strategies of how to better EDI in our academic institutions and research environments. We're not naturally equitable. We're not naturally inclusive. We're in a colonial structure and framework that has prioritized and privileged certain identities in many aspects of it. And just because all of a sudden today we think EDI is important doesn't mean those ideologies are going to disappear, right? The biases that exist, the realities is that as well, PIs, they still reflective of majority groups. And we know this tendency of affinity bias to surround ourselves with people who culturally reflect us and who look like us will still be perpetuated within these spaces. And so that's why it's on the structures to ensure that that doesn't happen, that those biases are mitigated for, and that we start creating and implementing things that mitigate for these. So I hope that answered the question as well in that way, but I think that's really important.
You'd think I'd learn about Zoom by now, but it's really, I think, what we've learned really over this past few years is that it requires leadership from the top, but we require everybody to participate, that this isn't just a single person. It isn't the single person who's of color in the room. It's really of everybody at the table to make sure that they participate. And I think that we really just need to keep challenging people to keep moving, right? And Justin Trudeau said in 2015, I think when his cabinet was finally gender parity, and somebody asked him, well, why'd you do that? And he goes, well, it's 2015. And I feel like my answer now, it's 2022 and we're moving and we need to keep moving. And I think that that's the needle that I think we need to keep challenging people on. So this is great. Cara, I'm going to ask you one question and then I'm going to go to the Q&A, and I'm going to do the Q&A a little bit rapidly so we can get through a bunch of points. But Cara, one of the things is through COVID, even though you don't like the leaky pipeline, there's definitely been active movement of people off and out of research, and COVID-19 has clearly impacted women in science. Is there any programming or things that are changing at CIHR or at any of the tri-councils to address the impact of women in science? And what could we do to be able to retain them, to be able to advocate for them from the trajectory of recruitment from PhD students all the way to faculty?
Thanks for the question. My answer is women are resilient. We will find a way to keep our place and rise. But it's been tough. It has been super, super tough. My heart really goes out to healthcare workers. I worked in long-term care outbreaks, that terror of coming home and giving it to your children when we didn't know what it was. Moms who've had to homeschool or have their kids at home. I mean, the nightmare stories of having 4 kids on 4 different computers who have different breaks. When do you give them lunch and when do you, contribute to your meetings and everything? It has just been exhausting. Women are more often caregivers. So what have the councils done? Also, women have been listening to their students. Women have really taken the time to help with all the mental health issues of their colleagues and their students. Well, we did a few things. We realized early on that we had to extend the deadline for grant applications at CIHR. So when we launched our second COVID competition, we right away added more time for people to apply. And for those of you applying to CIHR, hopefully you saw the announcement. Again, we extended the deadline for this project grant competition for the spring competition. We extended the registration deadline, we extended the application deadline, and there is talk of, in general, looking at that deadlines. A lot of people hate that September deadline. It's back to school time for kids, and do you really need to spend your last weeks of vacation submitting grants? So that is on the cards, but please understand that there's a lot of women working at CIHR who have to get the reviewers and distribute the grants, and that takes time too, because people aren't accepting to review grants. So there's a whole timeline that needs to be looked at. That's definitely one thing. The other thing that we've done is we put back the summary of progress page in the open competition. And in there's a space for folks to explain the impediments or challenges that they might have had that should be taken into consideration. So at least a space and a recognition that COVID has had impact for early career researchers in particular, not always, but these are often the women who have the young kids at home. And I don't want to be ageist here, but it's just the way it falls in terms of your reproductive and career pathways. We extended the time for which you can be an early career researcher. So you could still benefit from, we equalize, I don't know if people know that, but we look at application pressure, which means how many people are, the proportion of women who are applying and the proportion of women who get funded. And we actually equalize those rates for women, for early career researchers, and for minority languages. So I'll stop there because I know you have a lot of other questions. There's much more probably that we could do. We're trying. But hang in there, folks, hang in there.
Okay, so that's great, Cara. I think resilience is incredibly important, even before COVID and even more afterwards. I'm going to take one of the questions from the Q&A, and it's a little bit controversial, but I'm going to ask you, Brad, because I want to know what you think about this as an ally. And it's saying that knowing that some of the metrics are not equally as valued, unfortunately, one can say that, well, why do women go into those areas? And why shouldn't they go into areas that are more highly valued? So why are women still going into these underrepresented or undervalued areas? And what would you say to somebody who sort of challenges and says, well, women choose that space?
Well, I think the example of that stairway is a very good one. There are positions of privilege where it's easier for those to walk up that stairway than others, where there are many more barriers to cross. And that doesn't mean there aren't, many examples of those that have made it up to the top and have gotten through that. And the approaches that we take to try to change that or improve that, can help be a map to get there, but they can also be things to help remove those systemic pieces. And, I think it is around choosing what we value. As an organization or as a university or as a research sector, and ensuring that we capture the ways to measure our progress towards that value. So it does take time. It's not easy to change these systems and structures that promote privilege and which create oppression and barriers and challenges. But I think we as we try to work towards change, we need to not only be reaching out and trying to provide new supports and systems for those that are that are oppressed by those structures and systems. We also need to be always working on changing the structures and systems themselves. To remove that, that privilege and those barriers, and that's where I think the idea that the work that needs to be done is really by all. It's also by that group that is on the side of privilege, that benefits from those structures. It's often that is the group that has the ability to actually address the systemic and structural issues that promote and sustain that inequity, and that's where I think an ally needs to create focus is actually on those systems and structures of inequity itself.
Thanks, Brad. Yeah, I think that these underrepresented, undervalued areas may also be, it's the perception that compared to other areas they're undervalued, but in fact it could be incredibly important to those women. They could be incredibly important to that healthcare issue that they're trying to address, and it's just that nobody's taken a look at it or cared about it for many years. And so I think that's something else that we need to think about. And Imogene just put in the chat that pathways and careers that women enter often become devalued, right? So where a majority of women are, they become devalued. And how do we ensure that that doesn't happen, right? There's some questions about it was about the where do we think the barrier is for women in science? Like, how is it that is it starting in middle and high school? And are there things that we need to do much earlier on? And how can we sort of move that forward? And perhaps I'll go quickly to Lisa to talk about that. Like, do you think the issue is that it's fine at an undergraduate level and it's really, it's not the leaky pipeline, but it's that ladder up where going up the stairs that we kind of push them out? Or do we need to start earlier?
Well, I mean, I think we need to be thinking about it through the continuum for girls and women, and recognizing that not everybody has the same experiences we've talked about. And so, you know, half the population are women, as you pointed out earlier, and there's so much brilliance that's out there. And so I think we need to be starting, you know, probably at the elementary, middle school, high school level for sure, and thinking about pathway programs, making sure that people see them, women, girls see themselves represented in all of these careers, and don't get pigeonholed into certain areas where women have traditionally served. But I think we need to be thinking about, you know, what the issues are along the continuum, and making sure that our strategies are targeted accordingly, and recognizing again that not all girls and all women have the same experiences, and depending on your intersectional identities, we need to be thinking about that too. And you know, there are so many examples of programs that are designed to do that and to think about that.
That sounds great. We're going to go through one last question. The barriers are often about in collecting data and metrics are really the race data. And sort of if everybody could give me sort of one sentence really quickly, but I'll start maybe with Nicole. Race collection of data, like what has been the biggest issue for you at collecting it at the university?
The biggest issue, I think, trust. I think we really haven't developed enough trust with especially underrepresented groups and communities of underrepresented groups that actually trust our institutions, that when we are collecting it, that we're going to use it in a way that actually helps them. And that is not necessarily to the benefit of only the institution, but that will actually help strategize for dismantling those challenges and barriers they face.
Trust is a huge issue. Sarah and Cara, from a funding perspective, Sarah, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I think that's, I would echo Nicole's sentiments from a federal government perspective in terms of collecting data and making sure that we are then properly integrating it into our analyses of understanding the impacts of our funding programs. So I think, yeah, I would echo that.
Cara?
The biggest challenge is privacy. There's a government rule that you shouldn't be able to identify people. And sometimes when the numbers are so low, which they are, so for instance, the proportion of successful researchers, if it's a Black woman with a disability, then you're going to know who that is. And the government feels very strongly about protecting folks' identities. So we need to raise the numbers and rethink our metrics. I'll leave it on that note.
Okay. Indra?
Yeah, I just wanted to also add, you know, if we think about collecting race data at an organizational level, let's say my own institution at Sick Kids, I think we can't forget, as well as all of the factors already mentioned, it's resource intensive. So we actually do need money, people to be able to do this properly and really thoughtfully as well. And that isn't something just an EDI lead can go and do and collect data. So I'm just bringing that, it's, you know, it's a very costly exercise, and I think organizations need to make the commitment, addressing all of these issues, but really need to make the commitment to collect these data.
Lisa, do you want to answer quickly? And then I'm going to go to the next question.
Yeah, no, I would agree with everything that's been said. And I think I do, trust is true. I mean, just like really making sure that we're clear on what we're going to do with that data, how we're going to use that data, ensuring that the people who have been most disadvantaged by systems and structures of oppression are the guides actually for these conversations and how this work is done.
Okay, we're actually up for time, but I'm going to ask one quick question. You even have fewer seconds to answer, and that's really, should bibliometrics stay or go? Or maybe be a composite for promotion? So I'm going to start with Brad. Do bibliometrics stay or go?
I think they're part of what needs to be a much larger assessment of how we measure success and how we measure progress against the goals that we set.
It's great. Indra?
Yeah, I agree with Brad, and I just think we have to conceptualize metrics or reimagine metrics as well in a different way. And you can start off small, right? And really emphasize to people why it's important. So there's a whole awareness that needs to go on as well first.
That's great. Nicole?
Yeah, I don't think we can throw it out completely, but I think we can reevaluate, and I think we can repurpose for sure.
I like that, repurposing bibliometrics. All right, we're going to repurpose them. Lisa, what do you think? Especially if you're thinking about the Decanol Committee and promotion at University of Toronto. What do you think?
I completely agree. I mean, I think we can use them, but we need to ensure that they have the right proportion, I guess, and count according to what it is that we're trying to measure. So I think they can stay, but I think that there are many, many, many other things that need to be considered.
So I think that brings up the last point I'll make, and then we'll have to end, is like to the funders, really, for Sarah and Cara, if we're going to not eradicate but repurpose bibliometrics, then I think that'll affect the common CV. And so maybe that's something we should talk about in a future session, which will probably have lots of people wanting to comment on that. So listen, this has been incredibly exciting. Sarah, Allison's just going to put up a slide deck. I want to thank all of you. We had over 400 people registered, over 280 came today. It's super exciting to see all the comments. We're going to keep them. We're definitely going to have lots of work to do afterwards. And so I really look forward to further discussion. If you go next to the next slide, it's been great chatting with all of you. The big thing is, what can all of you do? And what I really want you to think about is not only challenging people to think about changing from the top of the leadership to the individuals, but we want output to go to outcomes. We really want to make sure we make a change. And like Cara's son, we're going to make sure we're trending and moving in the right direction. If you go to the next slide. So just to let you know also, there are 200 pages that are being developed today for Wikipedia. And why are we putting women on Wikipedia from University of Toronto and all the affiliated hospitals? It's because we want to honor them, make sure that when people and students are Googling them and they hear about them, they can actually see and they can think that they can be represented in science itself. Less than 20% of biographies on Wikipedia in English are of women, and less than a single percent are actually women scientists. So we're trying to change that as much as possible. There's one more session that'll be coming out in Women's Day, which is on March 8th, where we'll be talking about women's health. And so please join also the Power Initiative. And I'd like to thank Allison for co-hosting this with me, for all the panelists joining. I want you to know that we are trying to move forward. We will definitely have outputs from this. We're really hoping to engage in all of this. We're going to save the chats, record the whole session. And I really look forward to working with all of you. There are so many friends in the audience, so many interesting people that I would love to meet and talk to some more. And so we look forward to hopefully maybe having an in-person session eventually, but look forward to working with you all. Allison?
Yeah, I just want to add my thanks to Cara and the whole panel, but also my thanks to you, Rulan, and to Heather, and all of the staff at Women's College and all of the wiki writers and everyone in the audience. I think that, although today is the International Day of Women and Girls in Science, as Cara said, barks are nice, but we need bites. So we hope you'll think of every day as Women and Girls in Science Day, and that we can all be partners and actively working together to create change for a more equitable world for science today and in the future that we want to see. So thank you everyone for being here.
Thanks so much. Take care. Bye-bye.